one where you can't this is one where you can't argue with someone else. You can only ask clarifying questions, but we probably won't have time for that right now. So if you would like to share, I would ask you to keep it short, succinct, but a time where you felt God's presence, where, and if you can quantify why. So who's going first? Okay, Doug.
I would say probably two ways. Sorry, I got distracted. Some guys chewing at me. Anyway, there are primarily two ways that I feel God's presence. In nature is a big one, by a stream or by a trees or forest or something like that. But how about when you start falling in love with a new woman? Like, I feel it then too, when you start to experience the joy of meeting a new woman and falling in love, and like you feel it then as well.
Okay, so nature and love. Great,
Sure.
thank you. Who else could go? A time, a specific time. Yeah, Judy.
Okay, it came to me right away. We were fortunate enough to be in Africa on a safari in Botswana. And we were sitting around a campfire at night and the stars are out. And I won't go through the conversation, but some of the employees started singing the Botswana national anthem in harmony. And it was so beautiful. And I kept thinking, I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania and I'm here. And that's the most godly time I think I've ever felt.
So
as a specific.
Yeah, it was the sense of being in the world and experiencing
It was so incredibly beautiful.
The world was in harmony.
Yeah, the world was in harmony, and it was just, it made me cry because it was so beautiful. But I will say that was almost like a mirage. It was real, but it's never going to happen again. And most of the time, I don't feel God's presence.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, actually, what we say about this sense of yearning for God's presence or feeling God's presence is that it's an existential experience.
Mm-hmm.
It is not something that you can adequately explain to someone else. Even in the act of explaining, we know that we never come close to actually presencing, being actually in feeling God's presence.
And when I think about that time, it almost brings tears to my eyes. When I talk about it, think about it, it was very special.
Right. So for many people who have glimpsed or feel like they've glimpsed God's presence, there's this hunger to feel it again and a sadness when they don't. So Joan.
Can you mute us?
Yes, I was around 12 years old, and my father moved from living in Brooklyn. He started a business there. It was pre-civil rights South. It was all culture shock. We had no place to live. There was a housing shortage because the war was on. And my mother takes me to the bus stop and says, get on the bus and go to school. And she leaves me to go to school. I don't know where the school is. I don't know, well, I said, maybe some other children will come on the bus and maybe I'll follow them to the school. Sure enough, 2 or 3 students do get on the bus and I follow them and I still don't see the school. So finally I call out and say, can you tell me where the school is? And this girl turns around and she takes me under her wing. Guess what? She's Jewish. She not only takes me to the school, but she shows me where I can go to enroll in the school. And she said, I'll see you in the lunchroom at lunchtime. I'll have lunch with you. We do have lunch, and I tell her how we have nowhere to live. We're going to be thrown out of this hotel that we're staying in. Everything is going terrible for us. And she said, can I come back with you to meet your mother? And I took her back with me to meet my mother. And when she met my mother, she explained that her grandmother had an apartment. She had a furnished apartment. And my mother begged her to let her go and meet her so that we could get the furnished apartment. And she does. And the woman doesn't want to give it to my mother at first. She said, I promised it to a sailor and his wife. And my mother said, please. And this Jewish woman gave us a place to live. For me, there was God, because why else would the only woman the young student on the bus of all the people there be Jewish? Why is it that I follow her and she takes me to the school and she brings me a place for us to live? To me, that said, yes, there is a God.
For you, you felt God's presence. And if I can then tease out what I heard is in accidental friendship and in someone putting themselves out in significant ways to care for your actual physical needs. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the stories. So I'm going to just say we need to go quickly because we're going to go to the harder question, which is when you felt God's absence. So we're going to go to Dave and then Ed, who sent me pictures of his God experience from yesterday. Dave and then Ed.
Yes, I was traveling on business. This is back in the mid-1980s in New Orleans, the suburb of New Orleans. And I had sent my crew home. They weren't Jewish. And I said, I was in a suit anyway. And I said, I'm going to go to a synagogue down here. I'll walk. I didn't know where I was going. Turned out it was several miles away. I'm on a commercial highway walking. And a couple of kids in a car drop their window, slow down and say, hey, Jew boy, where's your beanie? I just kept walking straight. And the other driver must have said, don't bother with this guy. And they drove off, but it was really nasty. Now, 30 seconds later, an older man pulls up and he says, were those boys bothering you? And I looked at him, I nodded my head. He says, I think I know where you're going and it's a long way off. Can I give you a ride? And in that very moment, I said, something, that's God, that's something. That just so quickly picked me up when it was really nasty.
So again, it's the passerby who, the angel coming into your life. Beautiful. Ed, and for those of you who joined late, the question is, a time in your life where you felt God's presence? And I'm looking around at the Hollywood squares and know that there are times where you absolutely felt God's absence. Or people here, but right now we're doing a time I felt God's presence. We've agreed that feeling God's presence is existential, meaning it's hard to explain or describe to someone else. And once you've felt it, you want more. And if you've felt it, you feel a kinship in some ways with other people. You know how I know that? Because you're all shaking your heads up and down when you're listening to each other's stories. So Ed, you're going next. But unmute.
So if I may, I'll be very quick. And because we can talk nature, because I've definitely felt it several times, sort of been mesmerized. And I'll explain that. But the other time was actually when my parents were both on their deathbed. My father in particular, I'm the only huge storm. We all had to fly. Each brother got canceled. I was the last flight out of Newark Airport that night. Not canceled. Get there, my father's unconscious. He had been unconscious for quite a while. And they, basically said it's just no reason he's hanging on, but he's hanging on. And I went over to him, held his hand. And as I held his hand, all his vitals went up and down. 100% understanding that I'm there. He's unconscious. There's no medical reason for it. And within 10, 15 minutes, my father passed. And there was no good medical reason for him to have waited, have been there. I totally regarded it as a intervention, for me to be there with him.
Thank you. Ed was also sending me pictures, and I'm a fond friend of watching his travels in national parks and seeing the grandeur of nature. And it's been interesting to hear some of you talk about the grandeur of nature, how small we feel.
Yeah, and in nature, yes, the other day, this weekend on Sunday, the photos I sent you, because they were definitely like, oh my gosh, how can this be made? These were beautiful. The sea, it was a rocky area that everything just formed just perfect and in awe. And I've had that in a time actually during the holidays, at Rosh Hashanah. I was in Shenandoah National Park one time, and I purposely sat where the water ran around a stone island, basically, that I got onto. And I just lied down on it and looked up at the sky, and it was very quiet. The only thing you could hear is just the water running around you. And I've had a couple of other moments like that in really quiet spots in North Rim of the Grand Canyon, I think of, and a few others. And it's when it gets really quiet and you're looking and you're in awe, and it's just, there's a surrounding, you're wrapped basically in a feeling like, okay, this is an outer world experience. There's a quietness, there's a meditativeness, and there has to be a God. It just can't not be.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to say something before we move on? So I have two more, Michelle and Fran, and then Susan. I'm just going to ask people to succinctly, a time when you felt God's presence. Michelle?
Okay, so in 1969, I was part of crowds and crowds of people who flowed into the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av in Jerusalem. And when I got close to the wall, it was, it felt like I was with sort of all the Jewish people at the same time. Like everything had just kind of come together, because there was a lot of emotion of women crying at the wall, and yeah. So it felt like there was sort of a connection across time.
Thank you. And it was only 2 years after you could get to that wall. So Fran?
I also feel it in beauty and nature for sure. I've had a couple of very distinct transcendent moments in my life. And I think the most important one related to this was during the very process of my conversion, when I was in the mikvah, reciting the prayers, just lifted out of myself.
Thank you for sharing that. For those of you who haven't been to mikvah ever, we're going to take a trip, and we can also talk about getting you a trip to mikvah as well. Susan?
I had an experience a very long time ago. I went to Niagara Falls, and I remember looking at the falls and thinking, okay, it's very pretty, it's wonderful, but I didn't know what everyone was getting so excited about. And then I took a boat ride, the Maid of the Mist boat ride, which is a little boat that takes you very close to the falls. And suddenly I was sprayed with all of this water and from the falls. And it was like a moment that I felt as though the mist was all around me. And I was at one with, it was the most incredible thing that happened. Yeah.
So I want to call attention to the fact that nobody said shul.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Michelle said the Western Wall, which acts like an Orthodox shul right now.
I did have one shul I can say quickly on Yom Kippur.
Yeah,
Never mind.
I appreciate we have so much to cover. One of the things we said is, unfortunately, I have to go to another meeting at 8:10, so we're going to keep covering and put it in the chat. Yes, there are many shul times. For me, the very first one was at Camp Ramah in the Poconos, and the sun is setting over the lake, and we're singing Kabbalat Shabbat. And it just is something I can't describe, except if you've been there and you've seen it and felt it. And that was the first time where I said, I want more of this. And I feel like I do. And I would say, Michelle, for me, the place I feel God the most is Ne'ilah, the last service, when it's not a pandemic and all the Jews come back. But like the rest of you, nature, friends, loved ones, Israel, for me. And where I don't. The first time I did the funeral for a 14-year-old that died of leukemia, when I sat in the parents' room, the hospital room, where we had the discussions to decide when to turn off machines. When I buried a prisoner a couple years ago, not that long ago, right pre-pandemic, who was on, whose case was about to be reheard, and he suddenly slipped and fell in the prison and died. Jewish guy. So in the face of sadness and tragedy, I kind of throw my hands up and look for God. We don't have many Holocaust survivors in shul, and we certainly don't have many who come to shul on a regular basis, because there aren't that many left. But if any of you have encountered a conversation with a survivor who's lost much of their family, that's one of those times when you turn around and say, no, God, where were you? Where are you? So before I go into the more academic part of the evening, where we talk about what each of the Jewish movements believe technically about revelation and God and how that affects how they practice Judaism, I wanted to see if there's anyone who wanted to share a sense, like I just shared a little bit of, hey, God, where are you? Why aren't you showing up? And if you feel like you can't, that's okay. Yeah, Mickey.
I've had the experiences that everyone's talked about, and I always think they're wonderful experiences, but I don't see them as God.
Yeah, transcendent experiences, beautiful. Okay. And one of the things I said, the very first thing I said when I started is, this is the evening where there's actually no right and wrong. There's no litmus test for being part of the Jewish people. Nobody says, well, what do you believe, God, about how God works in the world? Doug, is it a question or a comment? You're muted.
Yeah, I would just say, if you've experienced prolonged oppression by a specific group of people, where they completely destroy every single part of your life and every single relationship in your life, I mean, I think at that point in time, you might stand there wondering, where is God? Why isn't he helping me? Why are my own people even doing this to me?
Yeah.
You might feel that way.
Absolutely. And that's why I want to think about how God works in this world. One of the things that I really appreciate about one of my professors, Rabbi Dr. Neil Gilman, who wrote about how we do Jewish theology, is that the time to have the conversation about what you believe is not in that hospital room and not in the accident, but now. Thinking about how God works in the world. I try to each year before Pesach, I don't know why it's before Pesach, it's just that's how it works out. I rewrite what I think my personal theology is. And I encourage you to consider doing that, and I will help you. Meaning, if you want to write about how you believe God works in the world, either actually or in metaphor, if you say God doesn't, that's okay. But we think of God in well, at least Jewish tradition as imminent and transcendent. And that's where I'm going to have Suzanne, can you share the longer document? I have two different documents that we're sharing tonight, which is why I asked Suzanne to help with the shares. Not that one, the longer one.
Rabbi, did you say imminent and transcendent?
Yeah, we're gonna do that in 1 second. Did you get the other one?
Do you see it? Because that's what I have up.
No.
Okay, no problem.
The
Give me a
second
sec.
the other document that I sent. Sorry. So as she's getting that up, we're going to do something about how traditionally we've seen God in traditional Jewish texts, but then what we're going to do is go through each of the movements of modern Judaism and big questions. Like the first big question is, what happened at Mount Sinai? So maybe put in the chat, what do you think happened at Mount Sinai? Here are the options. Nothing, and Moses made it up. God gave Moses in discrete words and letters the exact Torah. Or God had a conversation with Moses and then they talk about it, and the Torah is that record of it. Any of you believe any of those? Have you ever been asked what you believe about this? What happened at Mount Sinai? Okay, so the reason I ask that question, the real reason, is what we believe revelation was and is. Revelation meaning the moment Moses and God reveals God's self to Moses at Mount Sinai has a real impact on how we think Jewish tradition and Jewish law functions the rest of our lives, the rest of in our communities. Yes. Suzanne, should I keep looking for that text? Do you have the other one or no? You have it. Sorry. Oh, it's not this one. I'm so sorry. Let me see if I can get it. I apologize.
Sorry, Rabbi. These are the only two that I have.
Okay. I apologize to you all. We can just keep talking for 1 second because I wanted to show you this text. But you know what? We won't. Instead, I will just send it to you tomorrow and talk about it with you. So we have an idea of God being larger than life, transcendent. I believe someone used that word already tonight. These are transcendent experiences. And then there's God that is the intimate God. The intimate God you see at the end of Adon Olam. Biyado afkid ruchi. In your hands, God, I place my soul and I will have no fear. Right? I will have no fear. There's a question. And it's this idea. It's an idea that, I'm sorry, people are writing in the chat questions. So I'm going to ignore the questions for right now and say, so happy you're writing them. I'll look at all of them at the end. It's this idea that God is both larger than life and God is imminent and personal in your life. And in Jewish text, we have both of those. And they kind of contradict each other, right? Is God larger than life and something I can't understand? Or is God my personal God in who cares about your soul? And so your soul is going to be kept in God's hands every time you go to sleep at night. So those are two different conceptions of God, and both of them are in Jewish text. Does that mean both of them are true? Well, what you believe about God is intensely personal. So there was a question in the chat, which was, what is revelation and why is this important? Revelation, the very first time that God talks to Moses is in chapter 5 of the book of Exodus. It's going to be this week. There'll be a burning bush. What happens at the burning bush? Moses notices God's presence, has that existential experience, and then they have an actual conversation. By the way, what do we do with people today who say they have a conversation with God? Right? We usually send them for some kind of treatment. Except on the other hand, what we're saying is no, we believe you should have a relationship with God, but maybe it's bad if in that relationship, God tells you to do X, Y, or Z, and you go break the law and do it. So it's what are the boundaries of having these relationships with God? So the next very large time that God speaks to Moshe that's important to our discussion is at Mount Sinai. Parshat Yitro, it'll be in the third week of January, and we'll read about the 10 Commandments. And none of us were there. Even though Judith Plaskow wrote that great book, we were all at Sinai, standing at Sinai. Only Moses goes up. And so the question for the theologians, the people who study God, is what happened at Mount Sinai? So let me let you in on a secret. None of us know. Some people believe they know, but how do they know? So what happens at Mount Sinai, meaning how God communicates to people, will affect how you think about Jewish tradition and Jewish law and the plasticity of how Jewish law and Jewish tradition moves. By the way, again, this is not about how do you experience God, but what do we believe about how God works in the world? Have any of you read the book, Old, Small, Slim, and Important, When Bad Things Happen to Good People by my colleague, Rabbi Kushner? Yeah, his theology is very, very similar to Mordechai Kaplan's theology, similar to my own theology. And that helps me be in the world, thinking about how God works in this world. But it also helps me think about how can Jewish law change or not change, right? I can be in the hospital room with the child that's dying of a disease and not blame God, because I don't blame God, because I don't expect God to intervene, not for the good or the bad. If you expect God to intervene, you're likely to be very disappointed. If you expect God to be a caring presence, that we can hope for. There's a beautiful piece of Talmud in Masechet Gittin, the piece of Talmud that talks about divorces. And it says, what is God doing most of God's time? So anyone know the answer? Making matches. Making matches, finding your beshert. And then it says, what is God doing at the time of a divorce? Anyone know what the Talmud says on that? Crying at the altar. And so the question was, well, why couldn't God fix that marriage? And the wise rabbis 2,000 years ago said, that's not how God works in the world. God doesn't intervene in our daily lives. Which is interesting because we're about to read in synagogue, leaving Egypt, where God did intervene. But then there's a time in Jewish history where that all stops. Okay, I want to go to the more academic piece of this evening, and then we'll go back to the less academic. So now, Suzanne, could you share that terribly written old document, but it's the best one there is? This is from a book called Conservative Judaism, Our Ancestors and Our Children or something. It's by my colleague and friend, Rabbi Elliot Dorff. I don't know if you've studied with Rabbi Dorff. He writes about Judaism and ethics, but this is a source book he wrote for, of all things, USY. So that's the one I had wanted first. Okay, go to the next page. Suzanne, you found the one I was looking for before. Awesome. Okay, so go to the next page.
It's just 2 pages, Rabbi.
This?
1.
Can you go to the page after this?
There is none.
Huh. Okay, can you then go to the other thing that I sent you?
Yeah.
The one that you put up before. I'm so sorry. Someday
This
we'll.
is it?
No, this was the one I was looking for 10 before. Now I want you to put up the one you had before.
I have 2 documents, Rabbi. You've just
Okay.
seen each of them. Sorry.
And
So-
what for each of them? Yes,
I-
not this one. Put up the other one. I'm sorry.
The one with the squares.
Yes, the squares, the Hollywood
You got
squares. This document should be 13 pages long.
Which one?
No, just do the 2-page one. Sorry, 2-page. So, sorry for my technical difficulties.
No problem. Give me just a moment.
My technical difficulties, because I thought I have trouble sharing PDFs as opposed to just texts, but we couldn't un-PDF this in our office today. We tried to. Okay, any of you here raised in a Reform household? Good. Anyone Constructionist? How about Orthodox? Not Jewish? That's the easiest to do theology. Good. And how about conservative? Growing up, did anyone ever talk with you in Hebrew school about what you believed about God? You please unmute so I can hear you because I can't see you now. Yeah, no one. Okay. So
No,
what
yeah,
I'm gonna say,
I did
they did talk with you about God?
a little bit. Rabbi Meza from New York, Deer Park. Do you know?
I don't.
Just, okay.
Brother of
Of Jackie Mason and, okay.
Uh,
It was about praying to God. And what he said was, God, you pray to everything. Everything makes up God. And in my little class, it was, well, why don't we pray to the television? And his answer was, the television's only a part of God. Everything is God.
All right, this guy's pretty Kaplanian, pretty Reconstructionist. Okay, we are going to start with what everyone does, what the movements believe, and what I'd love for you to do is to take some notes and say, yeah, I believe that, or no, I believe that, in preparation for you to write your own theology. Okay, so Orthodox views. Most, if you go to the far left where it says some approaches, some exponents of the approach, Rabbi Lamb, Rabbi Berkovitz are modern, not even so modern, Orthodox rabbis associated with Yeshiva University. And they would say, go to where it says the nature of revelation, that 1, 2, 3, 4th column. Yep, thank you. Verbal revelation, the Torah, including both the written oral tradition, meaning all the Torah, and then all of the Talmud, consist of the exact words of God. I'm going to use he because I think they believe that. He gave it as one piece at Mount Sinai. So maybe unmute if you want and tell me how does that work for you. Someone wants to jump in.
I've never fully liked that version because I feel like we need to progress as a civilization sometimes beyond. Like it's not that I don't feel like the original was given by God. I actually kind of do, but I feel like we need to evolve a little beyond what life was like at the time this was given, so that we can increase our morality, not.
Okay, so what I'm going to respond to what Doug's saying. Go to where it says man's ability. This document was written in the 70s. People's ability to change the Bible's laws and ideas, and what it means if you believe that verbal revelation happened at Mount Sinai in discrete words, and they're the exact words and letters. The next part of that is that then the law is immutable. The law can't change. And why? Someone want to read where it says none, since God revealed the answers to all future questions?
And since God revealed the answers to all future questions at Sinai, and man does not know more than God.
Okay, so the exceptions would be when a new situation occurs, and let me give you that exception. What do I do? Can I use a microwave oven on Shabbat? Well, guess what? Microwave ovens weren't spoken about in the Torah. So these poor Orthodox rabbis in the 70s, when microwave ovens came out, had to figure out what would the Torah have said about it. But for the most part, if the Torah is given in discrete words and letters, and they mean the Talmud as well, then every answer is already known. And our job is to just find the answer that already has been said. This is not a popular view of people who end up belonging to members of a non-Orthodox shul. But we're going to go down to, there are 4 or 5 different views that people in the conservative movement end up believing. Remember, I'm showing you these so you can start to then write your own theology. Okay, I'm not going to go, the person you know most, Solomon Schechter, second one where it says conservative 1, and Abraham Joshua Heschel. Continuous revelation. It's just what it sounds like. God dictated God's will, and now I think Heschel would have been more of a feminist where he'd have lived longer. God dictated God's will at Mount Sinai and at other times. It was written down by human beings. Because it was written down by human beings, there are diverse traditions and even mistakes. If you were all in person, I would play Whisper Down the Lane with you. So that would, you remember Whisper Down the Lane? So Whisper Down the Lane is what Heschel and Schechter think about revelation. Moshe heard everything at Mount Sinai, but then told all these people. And they wrote it down and they got some of it wrong. And that's why there are radically different stories all over the Torah that contradict each other, right, Michael Golden? You know that because you study them. They contradict each other. This is continuous revelation, meaning sometimes we get it wrong. Okay, so can we change Jewish law? Yeah, but in very few places because the exact revelation did happen. Okay, we're going to go to something that's a little bit more liberal. Did any of you grow up using the Boxer Moxer, the very large High Holiday prayer book? It was done by Rabbi Boxer, Rabbi Gordis. Continuous revelation for this group of conservative Jews means human beings wrote the Torah, but they were inspired by God. How many of you think that is where you land? Yeah, I see. I'm playing around with the Zoom so I can see you all. Yeah. And that dictates something for how we think about Jewish life and law and practice. If human beings wrote down the Torah, they were divinely inspired, any one of them could have gotten it wrong, or any one of them could have not known the right language to use in any given time. Look at what that means for Jewish law and its ability to change. Human beings can change laws because rabbis in each generation may be inspired to change the law. Sometimes it would say they must change the law when there is I'm going to use the word, moral imperative. Even within the split of the conservative movement right now and within modern Orthodoxy, there are great debates that go on about what is moral imperative enough to make one change standard Jewish law. By the way, one of the big conversations about this is Zoom and live stream on Shabbat, more Zoom. Okay, let's go to the next page because not all of you agree with what was just said. Another form of conservative. This is frankly funny. The guy who wrote this document, Dorff, he puts his name in this. Agus, famous rabbi in Baltimore. Lieber, continuous revelation. The Torah is the human record of the encounter between God and the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. Since it was written by humans, it contains some laws and ideas which we may find repugnant today. What's the most repugnant law in the Torah you have today? Anyway, it's like a good party game. What's the Torah's most repugnant law? Anyone?
The homosexuality piece.
Okay, homosexuality piece. I could say eye for an eye, that we shouldn't be killing people if they kill, or take out someone's eye if their eye gets removed. Yeah.
Is one of them that if a woman is not faithful, she can be stoned to death?
That's pretty up there, Arlene. I like that.
I don't like that one.
The sota, right. So that says that that woman, the sota, who is accused but not even proven, can be stoned, right? It's terrible. So what these people say is, look, the Torah is just the human record. What's the difference between this? Between God and the people of Israel at Sinai, not just Moses, the entire people of Israel. So this one is interesting, and I think many of you might believe this, in that it says we continue to have encounters with God, and the law must be changed to reflect our new understanding of God's will. How many of you believe that? The law must change to reflect our new understanding of God's will. I think more of you would be comfortable with that. Okay, I'm going to the next one, which is actually Reconstructionist, but also conservative, meaning it doesn't matter what movement you put yourself in. It matters what you believe, and it only matters to you, meaning there's no test or litmus test to get into any shul or the state of Israel. Conservative Reconstructionist, written by Mordechai Kaplan, who is the founder of Reconstructionism, but taught at our seminary. Rabbi Schulweis, one of my great teachers. Oh my goodness, what does he think about revelation, or they think? There was no revelation. Human beings wrote the Torah, and there's nothing divine about it. How many of you are shocked by that? If you're shocked, you can unmute and say something. Okay, no revelation. Human beings wrote the Torah, and no divinity. Okay, so let's go to the Reform movement's guiding principles. Of course, these may have changed already, but I think this is truly what the movement believes. The Torah is God's will written by human beings. As time goes on, we get to understand God's will better. That's what progressive revelation is. And then every individual gets to decide. There's no sense of Jewish law. So can you stop the share? All right, I would love for you to unmute, if you could. And for a moment, think about if any of those views of revelation speak to you. Yeah, Polly.
I'm confused because I think I agree with the last three of them.
Yeah, okay. So if you had to say, this is what I believe about God, you believe that revelation was progressive?
I believe that God inspires people.
Right, so it wouldn't be the last one, or it wouldn't be the second one. God inspires people. And
but
then,
I think also people should figure these things out and bring it forward.
Okay, good. And that, of course, then has repercussions for what we do with God's laws, with the Torah, God's laws. Who can change them? Anyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you need to be educated. Some would say you would need to be educated. The Reform position is each individual person changes them. That's why, by the way, when people say there's a difference between Reform and conservative and Orthodox, there is. It's a philosophical difference about how Jewish law is changed. There may be communal things, but really this underlying question is, what do you believe about how God revealed God's self to us? Okay, anyone else? Which of these views speak to you or spoke to you, or none of them? Yeah, Doug?
I just have I'm somewhere between the second and the third one, but I guess I feel like God probably gave the Torah, but I don't see a reason to think that that's not a reason why we can't change it somewhat, because I feel like I've always felt like he was talking to a specific generation of people. So even if the rules were different then, that doesn't mean they were wrong per se. It just means he was speaking to a different time period, and we need to create principles from that to live in modern society, you know?
So that's about how God worked in terms of revelation. But more important is How do you feel like God works in your life? Is there a sense that you can call, what do you think happens when you're saying a Mishaberach, a prayer for the ill? That's the question to start with. What happens? And everyone's answer can be right to them.
I feel that I'm extremely focused, meditative, and it helps me. The words and the tune and the environment in which I'm saying it, helps me to feel a transcendence, to help, not in a capital T, but it helps me feel a connection to the words and to the power of the
A
words.
sense of sacredness.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Do most people agree with that? Or do you agree with that? Okay, here's a harder one. Do you think that saying a Mishaberach changes the medical outcome of a condition?
I think it can. I think there's power I think there's some power in that spirituality that can transcend our sense of what can be done. I do believe in that.
There are some people, and I'm by the way, I'm looking around this, and so many people in this Hollywood Squares tonight are people who have at one point in their life experienced tragedy. So you all have your own suitcase of sorrows that you won't want to trade, or you would want to trade. But the question is, does God intervene in our lives when we ask? And if not, are you okay with that? You want to talk about that for a sec?
I wanted to say, I don't think that happens. I think what happens is we as people have our own personal power. For some reason, I think, and that may come from God, and that power can keep us going and can intervene in ways that we may not feel as powerful as what we see happening. I don't know how to explain that, but sometimes, but I think that power comes from God. I think that I felt many times, not many, but a few times, that I've seen God in people because I've seen their goodness come out. It just amazed me. And
Yeah.
And I think that power, that good power, spiritual.
And many people believe that the power of that Mishaberach, or the power of the prayer, is the power of the group praying with you. And they feel transcendently changed, and certainly you do. And I recognize that not everybody does. Ed and Myra, and then Michael.
I think when I say the Mishaberach, I'm looking to feel God's presence more so than if I was to say to you, Rabbi, please say a prayer for me. It's not the same. It's you and me communicating. When I say for somebody's healing each Friday night, I'm really looking for some of my own healing, and some way I can feel or hope that it goes somewhere and makes a difference. So it's less about the receiver and more about the giver.
Okay, and I think that's probably for many people here, that prayer experience is about the person doing the praying, but that there's not necessarily an expectation that prayer will mean a healing of body, but it could be a healing of spirit. Your spirit, or maybe the person who is ill. Nancy Lewis and I were recently talking with a friend of mine who recently went through 2 brain surgeries. And she has literally hundreds of people praying for her during these brain surgeries. And she talked about the power she felt knowing that people were praying for her, that there were literally like angels in the room with her. I think it was Myra next.
Yes, I definitely have experienced the power of praying, and I felt that my prayers were answered. in one particular instance. But what I also wanted to say is somehow I find a coincidence can be a revelation to me when something you're not expecting happens, and it appears as a coincidence, but there's more meaning behind it, whether it's meeting somebody new and having a new relationship, or learning something new that was unexpected. I can't think of any examples right now.
I can. Joan getting a place to live.
Yeah, that kind of thing. I look at coincidences as a divine gift in many situations. That's what I wanted to say.
Do I have any other hand? Debbie? And then, oh, it was Michael first. I'm so sorry.
Just a comment on these coincidences, and then I'll make my other comment. There's a saying I'm sure many of you have heard of, which is, coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous. That God was there. That was, anyhow, I think any time any of us are going through tragedies, we're all praying for a positive outcome. And it would be hard for me, with the God I believe in, that God selects those people who are going to get well and those people who are not going to get well. So then what is the point of the prayer? So for me, I'm hoping that God will help the person undergoing the tragedy and myself deal with the tragedy and give us the strength and dignity to deal with this tragedy rather than change the outcome by God intervening.
Do people feel comfortable with that? Yeah. The power of the community praying, and the power of a sense of God's presence praying with you. That's why I brought up the part in the Talmud about God crying at the altar, meaning God doesn't fix it for us, fix the tragedies or difficulties in our life, but stands with us to help us through them, or to be a presence. And maybe for some, it's the person. Maybe for some, it's the nature. So why have this prayer? My greatest teacher of prayer used to teach me why pray every day, 3 times a day, or at least once a day. Why? Because once a year, you'll get that really great prayer experience. But if you learn the service and become part of the community, then once in a while, you offer yourself the opportunity to be on the inside of that particular prayer experience. But it doesn't happen every day. But when it does happen, like at Ne'ilah, Michelle, or maybe at some other prayer experience, maybe you do feel God's presence. I would love for you to write to me either in the chat or in email if there are elements of a prayer experience that have made you feel closer to God, so that we can help grow those for you here. Okay, who else is speaking? Debbie, and then Doug. Then we're going to move on to one more thing before I have to jump off.
So I just wanted to say that for me, the position that God holds is focus and intention. And the best example for me is that going to the Western Wall, you put these little pieces of paper in with something that you're praying for. And do I believe that if you put a piece of paper in the wall, it's going to happen? No. But I believe that if you think it's sacred and important, it forces you to prioritize and to think really hard about what is worthy of such a prayer. And that is beneficial to you because you are reinforcing your values and your priorities. And if you're brought up in a Jewish tradition that frames those values as to what's important, then it all comes together. It's not about a belief in God, it's about kind of an ethical focus.
Thank you, Doug. And then we're going to move on to 3 questions.
So I guess 2 or 3 aspects to that. Number one, I don't talk directly to God or ever hear God directly talking back. Just felt the need to put that out there. So
I do.
You do?
Okay.
Oh, that's great. As long as he's not giving you command things to like
Right.
kill people or things like that, you're good. You're good. So you know, I think the biggest power of prayer is actually and saying things like the Mishnah Berurah is not necessarily that it's going to make a difference in a specific medical procedure. Because I think some human experiences are kind of transcend that possibility. Like if someone has, you know, stage 4 lung cancer, like the statistics tell you about how long they're going to live, and they're probably right. You know, and I think it's important to know that. I really don't like doctors after the last few years, forgive me.
Okay.
But, you know, the doctors know the statistics, and the statistics are out there. And I think those are very powerful for figuring out how things are likely to go in a specific example. Okay. But where the prayer is powerful is, number one, it gives you a sense that there's something bigger than yourself. It gives you a sense that you belong to a community. And more than anything else, I found prayer to be very helpful in that it constantly teaches me to be appreciative of the things I do have. Every time we pray, we're supposed to give thanks for things God has given us or shown us. And the act of doing that on a regular basis makes you more grateful and makes you a little happier and content as a result.
Thank you. I want to thank the people. Thank you. I want to thank the people that have shared with me directly in the Zoom what brings them closest to God. The number one thing was singing together with others in a service or quiet. What I've heard from people who've been texting. And that is what we want to try to do. We want to create both joyful singing and deep moments of quiet. So more time during the Amidah where you're not running through words, but running through your heart. I'll often say at the beginning of the Amidah, please say the words that are on the page or the words in your heart. And then the music. So those are the 2 things that I often hear. I put something in the chat that I wanted to read to you. If you were going to write your own theology over the next few weeks, the questions that I would ask you to think about are, how does God work in our world? So, does God come close to you? Do you feel God's presence? And if so, where and how? Does God change things? And for some people, you should know, for some people, the answer is yes. For some people, the answer is no. Will God change outcomes? And where are times where you could feel God's presence? One of the things I want to invite you to do is to go back to the very beginning when we started an hour ago. And I want to review with you what you said about where you can feel God's presence. So I'm going to start with Fran. In a ritual that's meaningful. In a ritual that's meaningful and that's tactile, that you can feel, and that is not always about words. Mikvah. If you've never been to a mikvah, come, I'll make an appointment for you to go for some reason, but there's something tactile important about doing a ritual with maybe a little bit of words, but it's not the blessing that one says when they go into the mikvah. It's actually going into the mikvah. If you've never been in a mikvah, as a place of rebirth, and there's lots of reasons that people go, and I could take you for a birthday or to celebrate after you've gotten over an illness, or we could find a reason to go and celebrate. I go before Jewish holidays, before Pesach and Rosh Hashanah. So that was one. Find more Jewish ritual that you can be in and critique less. Meaning just do the ritual. Whichever rituals you can find. Kiddush or whichever rituals. That's why the rituals exist, to help us come closer to God. So maybe that's a service with a lot of singing. Not this week, but next week. This week I will not be here for Shabbat, but next week I'm going to do a contemplative service. There'll be a lot of singing and a lot of quiet. New Year's Day. So even if you have a hangover, you can come and I will give you something for your hangover. I'll give you some coffee. But come and experience a meditative Sukkah de Zimra. Nancy Lewis likes it, the meditative Sukkah de Zimra. And then a service for the middle of the service where there's just a lot of joy and a lot of singing, a lot of ruach. Be in that moment. The next thing I heard from all of you was nature. So how many of us find time every day to get out in nature, to take a walk, to go down by the canal, to go to the lake, to be in nature? Not all of us can live Ed Simon's life, but we can all find moments of time to just be out in nature without our phone, or maybe with a phone with a loved one, but to actually be. The next thing I heard were the angels in people's lives. When someone came and just did some angelic, angel-like work. So the question is, how can you be a conduit of God's presence by being the angel for someone else? How can you be a conduit of God's presence by being the angel in someone else's life? I'm going to embarrass Arlene here, but while the rest of you were cooking your brisket for high holidays, Arlene stood at the Jewish Center for many days in a row, collecting food. Now, there were some of you here who helped her, but she was there every day. I'm sure each of you have volunteer things you do. There's a couple people here who run the Zooms for us. So what can we each do in our lives where we are conduits of God's presence by making someone else's life better? Okay, so ritual. And if you're missing some ritual in your life and you'd like to try some new ritual on, I don't know, how many of you have ever put a tallis on or want to learn how? Come talk to me. How many of you, especially the women, I bet you've never tried tefillin on. Come try tefillin on. It's wearing God's Torah every day. Or going to the mikvah or some other ritual. Come sit and talk with me and we will talk about what ritual you could put in your life or add to your life to maybe add God's presence. Number 2, find a prayer ritual that you like. Okay, I'm trying to sell services at TJC, but besides that, you can sit and find one prayer a day that you could say as a mantra. Then do meditation. And next, go out into nature. And next, after that, be God's presence for someone else in the world. Debbie Dunn Solomon, Mora Devora, Shel HaTorah, has one final comment.
I just have a funny story. So, which, totally break the mood here. It was the morning of Erev Yom Kippur. I was in Israel and as a college student, and I took a tour that was offered of the Sephardi neighborhood in Jerusalem. And I didn't know anything about how the month before Rosh Hashanah was observed with shofar blowing and everything and services early in the morning. And we went to all these shuls where they were brightly decorated, gaudy, and people were walking around with coffee. And it was a whole different experience, one-to-one. And then I walked into this one where the women had to go upstairs, as in most, but it was a small little place. And so I was upstairs and I'd just gotten up there and someone must have leaned against the light switch because the whole place went dark. And then the lights went on again. But on the wall, which I had not noticed when I was getting up to the area, was a neon sign. And you know how neon goes on one letter at another after another, and it went Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey.
Yeah, well, it's lovely. It's a good story. So I'll end with another good story, which is when I first got my iPhone, I downloaded, and then I actually have to go. It's a beautiful story. I downloaded the Torah. And when I got the app and I did the download, it was not how downloads work now. It says, click here to accept the Torah. Have you received it? And I thought, well, that is one way to say that I've received revelation. Click here to download that you've accepted the Torah. So I do want to say, finding God in our lives is a practice. It's not something that just happens. It could happen, but it's a practice. So I'm going to just end again by saying, help make it a practice in your life. Maybe it's study every week. Maybe it is also nature. Maybe it's finding more ritual. Maybe it's finding a prayer practice. And by practice, we mean something with regularity. And then hopefully we can increase the amount that we feel God's presence. And with that, I bid you adieu. And please go to services on the morning of January 1st, that secular new year, for a different kind of spiritual experience. And
Rabbi, when is your next class?
I don't know. I don't have my calendar, and I have to go to the next, but it will probably be on a Tuesday night very soon after the new year. I want to thank Suzanne Esterman because I gave her a lot to do tonight. And also, let's all thank her because I really drove her crazy with my different texts. And be God's presence in someone else's life. Bye-bye, everyone. You can stay on. I have to leave. You can keep talking, actually, if you'd like, about what you'd like to keep learning, and then Suzanne will email me.
Sure. If anybody has any ideas or requests, I'm here, or you can email me. It's suzanne.esterman@gmail.com. So, and thank you all for crew and making this easy. And, I see all your faces, whether we're davening together or learning together, and that's where I see God. So thank you all very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.
Suzanne.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Rub it in, Ed.